Good morning, everyone. In this video, we are going to go over combat reforms. So this one page of the rulebook probably accounts for half of the rules questions I get during tournaments. And this is probably the second, maybe most complicated topic, seemingly, besides combat removing models. But I think more people are familiar with combat reforms, so it actually causes more questions, while removing models from combat is simply just done wrong a lot of the time, and neither party knows. We will do a separate video on that. So I will say that I do plan on having somebody from the rules team watch this video and tell me if I am right or wrong, but that I am not a rules team person. I just think I know the rules well. So there is a chance something in here is wrong. If there is, I'd probably either comment below or take the video down and make a new one, as I'm hoping that it's all correct. But anyway, this is for anybody who wants to know more about combat reforms and how they work. And let's get to it. We're going to have UV examples. We're going to look at basically this just one page and go through what it actually means and really parse out what it's trying to say. All right, so let's just read through it real quick, or start from the top. Each unit still engaged in combat after all fleeing and pursuing units have moved, and after post-combat pivots and post-combat reforms have been performed, now performs a combat reform. So what's significance to that? If you have a multi-combat where somebody gets out, they pursue beforehand. So if we go like here, for example, right? Let's just set up a quick example. I'll probably have to get more models out to do some of these examples. Here, and let's just get another giant, because let's just say you had this example and you killed enough warriors so that this giant was out of combat. You killed this back rank. Then this giant would pivot or overrun before anybody combat reform. So either he would go here or he'd pivot. This matters actually a little bit more when you maybe have a large combat, and I need to change to my warriors real quick. Let's say this is going to work. Okay, let's say you had a battle shrine fighting here, and it was like this, and let's say the giant countercharged here, and the giant killed this. The giant would get to overrun and hit this before this unit got the combat reform out of its way. That's basically what it's saying, is do all that shit first, and then do the combat reform. So that's a pretty easy sentence. Okay, units on the losing side in combat map pass the discipline test. In order to do so, apply the same modifiers. Break check, sure, we understand that. Just basically take another break check, but you don't get reforms from it, or you don't get rerolls. Like warriors don't get rerolls. I see people do that a lot. Easy enough. Units engaged in more than one facing can never perform combat reforms. So that actually, in my situation I was just talking about, if this hits and then overruns into here, this unit can now not reform. This is also, I'm not going to be too much of a tactical person in this video. It's not a tactical video, it's a rules explanation. But that is why sometimes you see people charge like light cav in the flank or a character or something, even though maybe it provides negative value, maybe like they lose more than they gain as far as combat res. Preventing people from reforming can be really good. Especially if you do something weird like, you know, double clip in the front. Like if you were to clip with a giant, and then like you charge some fast cab to fill these four guys, and now the enemy can't do anything. They can never reform, and so they're always going to be these two here, these two here. Or if you hit them in two flanks and you actually hit them both at like the top side, tactically, like if somehow you could, if this was like super deep goblins, right, and you double flank them, let's say there was like 10 ranks. If you double flank them and there was a bunch of ranks, you would eventually remove models until you're corner to corner. You don't actually slide this down. So the giant player could easily put it here if he wanted, but he could also just keep the corner to corner and just keep removing and nudging the giants down. So anyway, that's what that is. Hitting in multiple sides is good for breaking combat reforms. All discipline checks are taken. The active player decides which player performs a combat reform first after the player has completed all combat reforms with their units, one at a time in any order, so that's very important. The opponent combat reform. So people know this rule. If you both want a combat reform and the person who lost the combat made the check, the person whose turn it is gets to decide whether they want to go first or second. Tactically, this is one of the biggest things. The fact that I think it didn't used to be random. I forgot what it used to be, but let's just say that knowing if you get to combat reform first or second can be hugely impactful on outcomes of things. Well, maybe I will add some tactics since we're going to have time. Right? So a big example would be, let's just say, the giant player charged this battle shrine like this, and they both want to combat reform. Is that close and good enough? It's probably going to be a little bit better, but let's go like this, right? So right now, let's just say I want to combat reform, and the giant player wants to stop this unit from charging him over here. Let's just assume the giant was more this way. For whatever reason. Let's just say the giant wants to stop them from charging him. So if he goes first in combat reforms and goes like this and says, oh no, you can't get to me, this guy can just go all the way over here. But if the war shrine has to reform first and it goes here, the giant player could go second, cover up just enough frontage. Let's just assume this unit was over a little more. Obviously, it depends on the frontage. But he could, because he reformed second, he could say, you're in my front still, and there's no corner for you to get to, so you can't countercharge. So who gets to reform first, totally, assuming where, that going over a certain distance only gets you so far. So what the giant player should do is hit here. Giant player hits here, because he knows that he's going to make him reform first, and there's nothing he can do to pull the giant over more, and then boom, he goes here, and now he can't be charged. Actually, that's tactically important, because if you were to hit here to start with, then the war shrine player could reform here, and you'd be forced to reform here and get flank charge, or just give up, the corner or something. Anyway, that's what it is, and that's how it works. Who goes first? All right. Any order. Each player may choose not to combat reform one or more of their units. Nothing crazy there. You don't have to combat reform. All right. I mean, we went through half the page, and that's not even the confusing part. When performing a combat reform, remove a unit from the battlefield and place it back with the following restrictions. So all the complication comes from here. Okay. The unit must be placed in a legal formation following the unit spacing rules. Okay. The unit is allowed to come within half-inch units engaged in same combat, but cannot move into base contact with enemy units, so it's not in base contact before the combat reform. So this easy one. We're still easy, but we're going to keep going. So a big thing would be, if your units were like this, the giant can come within an inch of people in the same combat. If it was like this guy, so if the giant was here, and this guy was just hanging out over here, the giant couldn't combat reform to this part because he couldn't come within an inch of it. So that's why it's big sometimes. Like, let's just say this was chilling here, and let's just say it was chilling here, for example, and you charge this unit and ignore maximizing and stuff. Even though this is technically, let's just assume it was a legal charge with however they were. You have a decision. If you go outside and, if you touch here, you can't reform any farther over. But if you touch here to start, you have a little bit more wiggle room because you don't have to abide by the 1-inch rule anymore because you started within an inch. That's the whole unit spacing thing. This happens a lot with terrain. This happens a lot with just blocking reforms happens a lot. Like, you could do something like charge here. Is this actually good for... Yeah, you could do this. You could clip with the giant and then put a giant here. Let's just say somehow you could clip like this. You could put the giant here as the orc player, and now these warriors can never reform over because this giant's here. So that's some tricks and totally legal. The unit must be placed in base contact with all enemy units it was in base contact with before the combat reform and the same facing of enemy units. Okay, so this is where it starts to get, let's get really deep. Okay, the unit must be placed in base contact with all the enemy units. That's easy enough. You have to stay touching the units you were touching before. Normally that's pretty simple because it's just one-on-one combat reforms. Where this could get, I don't know if tricky is the right word, but let's just say it was like this. This is all one combat. You can't move the giant here and then move this unit in. And even though it's still all one combat, you can't take the giant away from the shrine. That's all that is. Easy enough. All right. Keep going. Half page done. This is it. All models in the unit must be placed with their center. Okay, that's easy. Man, we are going through so many bullet points, and we still haven't got to the part that confuses people. Remember their march rate from their position. Okay, you can't go over your march. That's usually not a problem, but it could be potentially. Characters that were in base contact with an enemy must still be after the combat reform. This applies to both friendly and enemy characters. A character may end up in base contact with different enemy models than it was before the combat reform. So this is where things get tricky, but also there is a little bit of people. I've ruled on this a lot of times and in my games, and people come back to me and say, hey, I thought we played it this way one game, or you ruled it this way. It's a little bit different here. In fact, we might want to go through all the combat reform rules, because then it starts to really get into the deepness of it. Let me just go through. Okay, so we know the characters of both sides have to stay in. We know that combat reforms are one unit at a time. After each combat reform, at least as many models in the combat reforming unit must be in base contact with enemy models as they were before. These don't have to be the same models. Alright, I want you to be very clear. That is the unit that is combat reforming. Okay. Furthermore, after a player has completed all their combat reforms, all enemy models that were in base contact with the opposing models before the combat reform must still be in base contact after the combat reform, but they may be engaged with different models or units. So let's break this down to what this actually means. You are going to do multiple combat reforms. You will do them one at a time. First off, you must keep characters of both sides in combat after every combat reform. That's step one. Step two, you have to keep at least as many models of your combat reforming units in base contact with enemies after each combat reform, and we'll see how that works. They don't have to be the same models. These don't have to be the same models essentially means you don't have to keep the same rank and file models of your combat reforming in combat. Characters was already taken account above, so you can't bring a character out. But you can change which models of yours are fighting. You can take out the champion, because he counts as rank and file. You can, turn, doesn't matter. You can take out your models. The end, furthermore, after a player has completed all their combat reforms, so once me as the player is done moving all my units, I need to keep every single model that was in base contact with me before in contact. I cannot change rank and file. I cannot take out champions. I can only switch who they're fighting, essentially. So, what does this mean in practice? Alright, so, let's take a simple case. I am fighting this giant. The warriors want to combat. Okay, the giant wants to combat reform. It can't do anything except turn its flank if it wants, or turn its rear. Because it is touching 4 models. It cannot end its combat reform not touching these 4 exact models. You cannot shift to these 4 because this guy's taken out. The warriors can reform. They can reform. They can move. They can put this guy in if they want. They can, because once they move, how many of their models are in combat? 4. How many enemy models are in combat? 1. All good. They could even reform like this and move the champion over because they still have the same number of models. They don't need to be the exact same models. And this is why I don't have ready to get one out. Let me get out a warrior's character. You know, let's just do a guy on a horse. They have a guy on a horse, right? Now, let's say you were like this. You could not reform the character out of combat because you can't move characters out of combat with the reforms. But if the character was here, let's just say the fight was here, if this rule wasn't in place, that it didn't have to be the same models, you could never reform this character in because of this model. Oh, I can't leave with these models. But that's not a thing. This character can easily reform right here and fight. Hopefully that made sense. That's an easy case, right? So as the combat reforming unit, you can move your models around. You just need the same number, and you need to keep characters in if they were in to start. That's it. You don't have to keep the same models. You have to keep the same enemy models. So again, here, let's just say somehow we clipped like this. Let's just say somehow these two units were fighting, and let's even take out this this champion just because. And this champion probably doesn't matter, but it's 3 versus 3, right? When you reform, you have to keep these 3 models fighting. Have to. So you can't go and touch these 3. You can change these guys. You could easily... Now you can go 5 wide, because those 3 are still in combat. You can do more models, but that's not what we're talking about here. Alright, another example. Alright, let's keep going with it. Let's take this away. Okay. So what really gets confusing is when there's multiple combat reforms. Let's say 2 giants hit like this. And the giants want to reform first. This is a legal combat reform. You don't even need a champion. It doesn't even matter for this case. You could put this giant here. It moved within its march rate. It's still in combat with the same enemy. And it's still 1 models in combat. You can't end the reform like here because you don't abide by the last rule after all combat reforms, right? But you could move this giant and touch 4 here if you wanted. That is perfectly legal. Still 5 enemies in combat, still your models are in combat. You're all good. Now what you couldn't do is this. Let's say you were like this. And let's say, well, it depends on the situation, but you could not, I should not use the same model. I should get something else. Let's just use a different looking giant. Just because you guys actually won't know when I change giants. Let's say you had 2 giants fighting like this. You cannot put this giant here and then move this giant here. Yes, it is a legal end formation if you could do it, but because reforms are 1 at a time, this corner isn't available for this giant. If you really wanted to clip with this giant, you can move to this corner and move this guy down, but that's not what we're talking about. Reforms are still 1 at a time, so if the end formation is legal, you still can't do it if it doesn't work as a 1 at a time move. So we've discussed that, touching every model, if you're like this, you can easily go like this, and as long as you fill this gap with models, albeit this, you're good. You could do this even. Let's just say you had Shaman, this BSB. Let's say you charge like this, and you decided, oh, my giants are getting wrecked. I need to clip with them. You could move the BSB into here, touching 3, and you could go and clip with both giants. This is perfect. That was a perfectly legal reform. All right. Now, I think this makes sense to people. I think some people get confused where they're like, oh, in this step, my enemy units, you're not touching, you took these 3 models out. But as long as you finish, you're fine, because that's the whole point of the whole, after all of reform. Now, after each, at least as many models. So what that means is, as the combat reforming unit, like goblins, right? If the goblins were touching 4, and it had a giant with them, the goblins can't like go and touch one and then have the giant cover because these four are out. So you still have to keep as many models in. Like you can't remove goblins from combat. You can't trade it for others. So that's a good point too. I think this one has come up before, and let's say you have 2 ranked units. And so right now you have 2 orcs, and let's say you have 5 goblins, right? Perfectly legal. You cannot make it 4 goblins and 3 orcs. Even though it's still 7 models like it was before, instead of 5 and 2, it's 4 and 3. That is not legal. This goblin has to stay in combat, period. Alright. I think that is pretty covered. I think that is explained well. The characters, in my opinion, is the weird one, and it actually creates some very unique scenarios from what we were just talking about. So, we've established that champions are rank and file. So none of what I'm about to say applies to champions. Champions can be moved in and out. You can't remove a champion from combat. Well, we already talked about that, right? When you're reforming, if I'm the giant reforming, I can't take this model out because it's in combat. So at the end of my reforms, these 4 guys have to be touching, as if I'm the giant. If the warriors are reforming, it doesn't matter which 4 models touch me, just as long as 4 models touch me. So they can remove the champion if they want. Okay, that's established. Characters are a bit different. So let's do an example with a goblin mage, right? And in fact, I'm going to spin them around because I think it's easier to see this way. Ooh, this is exciting stuff. It's actually not that hard to explain. It's not that complicated, but I know it gets wrong. So let's just say we're going to go to a very similar example before. 2 giants fighting a unit. We talked about all the cool reforms you could do with the warriors. This will be a little bit different. Alright? So let's say this corner's open, and this giant's touching 2. So we got, let's say he's even over or top this. Okay. So we're going to do I'm going to show the old example, and then I'm going to do the new example. So in the old example, we said you could reform here, and then you could reform here. Here. 5 goblins touching, your 2 giants touching. It worked one at a time because the corner was open. If the mage was here, you could not do that reform because you cannot bring characters out of combat with a reform. I know that it's coming back. But it specifically says characters that were in base contact with an enemy must still be after the reform. Characters mess up this furthermore after the players completed other moves thing. So that was not allowed because the character was here. Right? Let's say the character was here. You could do it because you couldn't do it. You couldn't do it. There's nothing you could do. If it was like this, so if it was like this, now you could do it because you could bring him here, the character's still in combat, and move him here, the character's still in combat. Actually, this is the example I wanted. If the character was here, you could do it because you could go here first, character remains in combat, go here, and we end with the same number. So interestingly how it doesn't work if the character, no, he's gone. If the character was here, does work if the character was here. Actually, the only spot it doesn't work is the character being here. Because if the character is, well, obviously, if the character is any of these 3, this giant's already touching him. If the character is here, you can move this giant to here to touch it. So move this giant for, oh, you couldn't do it. It doesn't work with this one. You could only clip this way. But that still makes sense. Does that make sense? Like, you cannot remove an enemy character from a, even though you're going to end up fighting it at the end, you can't do it in the step-by-step process. Now, if the enemy character, now, I guess if this way, okay, let's do this way. I don't think we need champions for this. Let's say it's this, and we have a BSB. Alright, let's say these two units are fighting. You can, as the orc player, reform your character here. You do not have to remain touching your character. This guy is fighting, you're fighting, same numbers of models are fighting, same models are fighting. They're just fighting different people. That is 100% legal. Now, if you reform first, the enemy could then just move their character back in front of you. But that is 100% legal. You can move your character around. In fact, you can go from this position where your BSB is fighting a character and two others to this position where your character is just fighting one guy. Your character does not need to be fighting the same number of people, just that you have the same models, all the other rules before. That is an important one. Who goes first? You can move across the unit. It doesn't matter. You can move to touch different characters. If it was like, if this goblin was hanging on the side of this unit, it'd be perfectly legal for this guy to go touch this one instead of this guy. Nothing wrong with that. I think the one that confuses people the most, like we said before, if it was like this, with a giant, you could put the giant here, and then let's say this was a really fighty character you didn't want to touch with any of yours. You could go like this. Character's still fighting somebody, blah, blah. Now, you couldn't, if you had more room, you couldn't move this unit first and take him out of combat. We talked about this. Okay, a better example would be orcs were 6 wide. Let's say the orcs are 6 wide, right? You could not reform the giant first and move this unit over because you can't take the mage out of combat. So in this instance, now if you do it in the right order, it doesn't matter because you could move this guy over and then you could just go like that. It's not a big deal. But there are times where you cannot do that. So this is probably the best example of it. In this situation, if you wanted to, let's just make it a little more easy to read this, and let's make it 6 wide. All right. In this situation, there is no way to get this giant to touch this guy because you cannot move the giant away from the mage because there's no corner to move into here. And you can't leave, and there's nothing you can do. So this is like a tactical thing when you're charging. When let's say the warriors charged, and they had to charge like this, and they know that after combat reforms they want to get. In fact, it's kind of funny. So as the warriors player, you'd want to charge like this. Give yourself a little room to move over, or just corner clip to start. Right, corner clip here to start, and then you're free to move the giant over. Obviously, the orc player gets to reform first. The funny thing the orc player could do is there's nothing. Let's say the orc player wants to. So we're here. We're corner clipped here. Let's say this is how it looks after the combat. And let's say what they want to happen is they want this giant to touch this character, and they don't want to touch him with this. And the orc player, for some reason, wants to stay on the corner. If the warriors go first, they can go like this, and they can move over. But then the orc player can just reform his character like here. It doesn't do anything. So if the warriors player makes the orc player go first, tactically the orc player can go like this. He can move down a little bit. Nothing illegal about what he did this. But what he did do is make it so it's impossible for this giant to reform over here because it's touching the character and he can't not touch it. Now, the orc player could reform the goblin out of combat. Nothing not allowed. Let's just say this was it. Let's say it was the orc player doing it. Orc player wants to reform, and what he doesn't want, let's just even take out this guy. The orc player doesn't want this goblin to be attacked by the giant, and his only goal is to stop that from getting attacked. He could reform like this. Now, in this particular case, if the goblin went first, the orc player could get out of it. He could reform here, shift down the warriors. But if he did this and put his BSB here, if he ended the combat, or even, if he put the combat exactly like this, his reform was 100% legal. Everybody's still touching, everybody in the enemy still touching, blah, blah, blah. But now he's made it so the enemy can't reform the giant to the other side because he can't cover the BSB. Like, once he moves this, it's illegal. And he can't move the warriors first to move over. There's actually a lot of combat shit you can do with reforms with character. I think the biggest one is, everyone knows, first step of learning is that multiple units can reform and, like, create space, right? You can go from this to this if you want, or the one I showed in the beginning. You can go from this you could charge like this and say, I don't want my giants to be touching so many. Put the BSB in the middle. Put this giant on the flank. Put this giant on the flank. People don't get that, and now they do. People don't get that it's number of models for reforming units. So like I said, you can, if it's the warriors reforming and they have a character who's not in combat, they can just put the character in combat, stuff like that. And I think the one that probably is a little deeper that people don't get is, because in your head it's, after all my reforms, I need to touch all the same models of the enemy. But the caveat is, during the reforms, you cannot remove characters from combat, which is a big one. The biggest being what I just showed. If you had, I think what came up in my game that caused a little confusion, but now it makes sense. So if he watches this video, he'll know exactly why. Let me just find it. I think it was this. So it was like a dragon, and it was like an orc unit, and it had like a goblin mage. There's like a dragon here. It's like an orc mage, and then it was like another hero, but it was a wood elf army. Let me just grab another hero, like a dais. Okay, it was something like this, and he wanted to. So he's touching every model, and I guess it's probably not like this. It was probably like this, with this corner open, and he wanted to go like this, and like turn the flank or something. Let's just assume it was correct. It wasn't this, but you couldn't do this because of the goblin being a hero. Oh no, it was like this. There we go. He was like this, and he wanted to go and put this on this corner and then move this to here. Legally, sure. If everything was rank and file on the enemy side, if this was just if it can't be because it's obviously attached on mismatched space, but that can't be done because you can't leave this goblin with this particular model because there's nothing to cover it up. If you had 3 units. If you had 3 units, you could go here, here, here. That's legal. One at a time moves. No character was ever out of combat between any of the moves. All 3 of your models are touching. All of their models are touching at the end of the combat. Perfectly legal. And that's it. I think I've explained them all, oddly enough. Oh, that took 34 minutes. That was okay. I had a lot of examples. That is how you combat reform. That is all the ways it's legal. It is illegal. You can turn your flank. You can turn your rear. Just note, that is what it means. I mean, it's pretty easy. I think when you really read the rule and what it's saying, it's not that difficult, but I think people get confused on who has to, when do you have to remain all the models? Is it at the end? What's the deal with characters? When can you switch? I think the big one is when you're reforming, it's number of models. in your units. You can switch in characters, switch out characters, change which models they are. When it's the enemy unit, you are keeping their exact models in combat at the end. Like I said, I did all this one where everybody was covered up. Let me just do one more, I guess, since we're here. And I alluded to this one, so it shouldn't be that. I'm just doing an extreme example so people understand. If you charge this, with a giant, you can never, well, never is the wrong word. You cannot go over here, period. You cannot reform all the way that way. The enemy could reform their whole thing like this if they wanted, assuming the 8 inches. You cannot change which models you are fighting. So if you charge like this and there is a character over here, you can never reform to put it in unless the enemy wants to let you do it. That is why some people will do things like this, where they'll let you charge their unit, but their character is blocked. So, because if you charge here, there's no way you can ever reform yourself into combat. Obviously, the only way you could do this is if they were stupid and they let you charge here, and then they move this away. Then you could turn your flank, and now you can touch 5 models and add the mage in, for example. Anyway, thanks for listening. Enjoy the rule stuff.